A strategy for testing, thinking why we test. I was there in Singapore when the cases started shooting up. How did I know? Because I was supposed to get out of my 14 days of quarantine after I arrived, but they announced that they implement a lockdown starting the day after I got out of quarantine. So while I really wanted to go to a restaurant, eat some good Singaporean food, I wasn't able to. Every day, Singapore's Ministry of Health says how many new cases of coronavirus there are. On June 5th, it was 261. And they actually break it down into how the cases were acquired. Imported cases, cases in the community, and cases in the dormitories. And the vast majority are always from the dormitories. For this particular day, it's 250 out of 261, more than 95%. And everybody in the world now knows how Singapore is struggling. They are one of the safest places in March. Now they have the most cases in their region. They're trying to ramp up their testing from 8,000 to 40,000 tests daily. But where do you think most of those cases are? Obviously, the dorm residents. The scale is in the hundreds. The community cases are in the tens. Obviously, they're going to test the foreign workers in the dormitories. Though my friend in Singapore, who's a doctor, said they might as well not test them. Just quarantine them all for a month. But that sounds rather harsh, right? Well, let's look at their strategy. What is their strategy? It's testing everybody. It's actually twofold. It's different for dormitories depending on whether they have few or many cases. Number one, for the dorms with high infection rate, they'll do serology testing for antibodies. If a worker is positive, then they'll isolate. If the worker is negative, then do a PCR. Then they isolate for 14 days because it could still be a false negative in the incubation period. Then they retest after the 14 days. If it's then still negative, the person is cleared. In the dorms without a high infection rate, they do the PCR testing first. If the worker is negative, then they isolate for 14 days, then do another PCR test. And that test is negative as well, then the person is cleared. If they're positive, they isolate. Is that confusing? Let me draw it out for you. So first you determine if the dorm is a high risk or low risk dorm, depending on how many cases there are. If it's a high risk dorm, you do serology. Otherwise, you do PCR. If the serology shows they have antibodies, then you isolate them because they may still be infectious. I'm actually not clear how long they get isolated for in this particular case, or if they're using PCR to clear some people. If the serology is negative, you get a PCR, which is also what you get initially if you're in a low-risk dorm. If the PCR is positive, then you get isolated. If PCR is negative, then you still get isolated for 14 days. And then you redo the PCR, and if it's negative the second time, you are cleared. If it's positive, then you get isolated. If you just look at this, something is very clear. There is no green arrow. There is no way to be cleared right away. Everybody gets isolated initially. And as of April 14th, 8 out of the 42 dormitories have already been gazetted. What is gazetted? It's the same as quarantine. What is quarantine? The government makes it very clear. They cannot leave. Period. The whole dormitory is quarantined. And remember how I said it was 8? Well, I don't know if you could count here. This is later, in June. It's 25. The majority of the dorms. So why are they doing all this testing when it basically seems like the outcome is isolating everybody in every single dorm anyways? Optics. Prime Minister Lee of Singapore promised Prime Minister Modi of India that he'll take care of the Indian migrants like their own citizens. And this is how you make people feel like you're doing something, like you're taking care of people, by testing. Because you are using the testing, the objective data, to make a decision. You may have seen this before. It's called a Rubik's Cube. You twist the sides around and the goal is to make it so that every single side has only one color. And you may think the strategy is to twist it and see the results. And from those results, you twist it again, right? Solve it line. See all the colors together on the side. Done. Apparently not. You don't have to actually know the result because you already know the result. And it's the same case. with the Singapore dormitory testing, you already know what's going to happen. Number 1 or number 2? Oh, wait. They're actually the same thing. Isolation. So why bother with the testing and waste so many swabs when you're just going to isolate everybody anyways? Optics, as my friend said. Their current goal in the community, given that worker dormitories are practically all isolated anyways, is to find people who are spreading the virus. In this statement, the Singapore minister calls it unlinked cases. If somebody has symptoms, it's relatively easy to spot them and deal with it, because in Singapore they would seek medical attention. If somebody were in contact with a known case, they'd be found out by contact tracing. But if someone has neither of these, they're unlinked, and Singapore's government cannot find them. Wuhan spent $126 million testing everybody. And they found 300 asymptomatic cases they couldn't have found otherwise, and they said it was worth it. But Singapore simply doesn't have the ability to do that many tests. So how are they going to do it? I don't know. He didn't say it, but I think sampling is the best way, and we'll talk about this next time. Actually, evidence-based, data-driven testing, unlike the testing in the dormitories, which is just, as my friend said, for optics.